The autumn wind howled through the pines of Glacier National Park as Detective Lisa Hawthorne stood at the edge of Bowman Lake, staring at the same spot where 12-year-old Danny Reeves had vanished without a trace in October 2001. The case had haunted her for over a decade, and now, in 2013, she found herself back where it all began. The morning mist clung to the water's surface like ghostly fingers, and the familiar ache of unresolved grief settled in her chest. Danny's disappearance had been the kind that destroyed families and careers alike. No body, no witnesses, no answers. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, we'd love to have you join our community. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one and love connecting with viewers from around the world. The Reeves family had come to Montana from Minneapolis for what was supposed to be a healing vacation. Tom Reeves, an insurance adjuster, and his wife Janet, a nurse, had been struggling with marital problems and thought the wilderness might help them reconnect. Their son Danny, a bright kid with sandy hair and an infectious laugh, had been excited about the camping trip. The family had set up their tent at the Bowman Lake campground on October 15th, planning to stay for 5 days of hiking and fishing. On the morning of October 17th, Danny had asked permission to explore the shoreline while his parents packed up for a day hike. Janet remembered checking her watch. It was 8:47 a.m. when she last saw her son skipping stones into the crystalline water. When they called for him 30 minutes later, ready to head out on their planned trail, Danny was gone. His fishing rod lay abandoned on the rocky shore. His jacket hung neatly on a low branch, but there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away from the water's edge. The initial search had been massive. Park rangers, local law enforcement, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers had scoured every inch of the surrounding wilderness. They'd used tracking dogs, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment. They dragged the lake bottom and searched every cave, every ravine, every possible hiding spot within a 20-mile radius. For weeks, the story dominated local news. Tom and Janet Reeves appeared on television repeatedly, pleading for information, their faces etched with the particular agony that only parents of missing children understand. Detective Hawthorne had been a junior investigator then, working under Detective Ray Patterson, a grizzled veteran who'd handled more missing persons cases than he cared to count. She remembered how Patterson had worked the case with dogged determination, following every lead, no matter how remote. They'd interviewed everyone at the campground, tracked down suspicious vehicles spotted in the area, and investigated every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius. But as weeks turned to months, the leads dried up, the media attention faded, and the case grew cold. The Reeves family had eventually returned to Minneapolis, but their marriage hadn't survived the loss. Tom had thrown himself into work, taking longer and longer assignments that kept him away from home. Janet had quit nursing and devoted herself entirely to searching for Danny, traveling to psychics, following up on supposed sightings, and maintaining a website dedicated to finding her son. She'd aged 20 years in the span of 2, her once vibrant smile replaced by the hollow look of a woman living in perpetual hope and despair. Now, 12 years later, Detective Hawthorne found herself holding a piece of evidence that changed everything. The VHS tape had been discovered by a construction crew renovating an old hunting cabin near Whitefish, 30 miles south of where Danny had vanished. The cabin belonged to retired Professor William Ashford, who died the previous winter. His nephew, cleaning out the property before selling it, had found the tape wedged behind an old filing cabinet in the basement, along with newspaper clippings about Danny's disappearance and a detailed map of Glacier National Park, with several locations marked in red ink. The tape itself was unmarked and partially damaged, but the FBI's video enhancement unit had managed to recover most of the footage. What they'd found had sent shockwaves through the investigation team and brought Detective Hawthorne racing back to Montana from her current posting in Billings. The tape showed Danny Reeves, very much alive, sitting in what appeared to be the same cabin where the tape was found. He looked older, maybe 14 or 15, and he was speaking directly to the camera with an urgency that made Hawthorne's blood run cold. In the grainy footage, Danny explained that he'd been taken from the lake by someone he trusted, someone who'd convinced him to come quietly by claiming his parents had been hurt and needed him. He'd been held in the cabin for what seemed like months, though his sense of time had become confused. The person who'd taken him, Danny never spoke their name clearly on the tape, but referred to them as the teacher, had told him elaborate stories about why he couldn't go home, why his parents wouldn't want him back, why the outside world had become dangerous. The most chilling part of the recording was Danny's matter-of-fact description of his captor's psychological manipulation. He spoke of being shown fake newspaper articles, claiming his parents had died in a car accident while searching for him, of being told that he was safer in the cabin, of gradually coming to believe that his old life had been a dream. But then, something had changed. Danny's voice on the tape became more urgent, more desperate. He explained that he'd overheard his captor talking to someone on the phone about the next one, and realized he wasn't the first child to be brought to the cabin. The recording cut off abruptly after Danny mentioned finding things that belonged to other kids, hidden in the walls of the basement. The enhancement team estimated the tape had been recorded sometime in 2003, based on background audio that picked up radio broadcasts from that period. But what had happened to Danny after making the recording remained a mystery. Had he escaped? Had he been moved to another location? Or had something darker occurred when his captor discovered the tape? Professor William Ashford had been a respected member of the whitefish community, teaching environmental science at Flathead Valley Community College for over 30 years before retiring in 1999. He'd been known for his wilderness survival courses and had often taken students on extended camping trips throughout Glacier National Park. Colleagues described him as passionate about conservation but increasingly eccentric in his later years, developing what some called an unhealthy obsession with the corruption of modern society and the need to protect young people from its influences. Detective Hawthorne spent hours poring over Ashford's background, looking for connections to Danny's case. She discovered that Ashford had been at Bowman Lake the week of Danny's disappearance, ostensibly conducting research for a book he claimed to be writing about the park's ecosystem. Several campers remembered seeing him around the area, and one park ranger recalled that Ashford had asked detailed questions about the search effort for the missing boy. What made the connection even more disturbing was the discovery of additional evidence in Ashford's cabin. Hidden behind false walls in the basement, investigators found personal items belonging to at least 4 different children: a girl's hair ribbon, a boy's baseball card collection, a small pink sneaker, and a wooden toy truck. Each item was carefully preserved and labeled with dates spanning from 1987 to 2004. The implications were staggering. Danny Reeves might not have been Ashford's only victim. The investigation took on new urgency, as authorities realized they might be dealing with a serial child abductor who'd operated for nearly 2 decades. Detective Hawthorne coordinated with FBI behavioral analysts to develop a profile of Ashford's methods and potential victim selection criteria. They theorized that he'd targeted children from families who were isolated, either geographically or emotionally, making them less likely to mount effective searches or maintain media attention over time. As news of the discovered tape leaked to the media, Tom and Janet Reeves found themselves thrust back into the spotlight they'd tried so hard to escape. Janet, now living alone in a small apartment in Minneapolis, had never remarried and had spent the intervening years working part-time as a medical transcriptionist while devoting most of her energy to missing children advocacy. When Detective Hawthorne called to tell her about the tape, Janet's first words were, "Is he alive? Is my boy still alive?" The question haunted everyone involved in the case. The tape proved that Danny had survived at least 2 years after his disappearance, but 9 years had passed since the recording was made. At 24 years old now, Danny would be a grown man, if he was still alive. The possibility that he might have escaped and been living under a false identity somewhere gave the investigation team hope. But the darker possibility that Ashford had killed him after discovering the tape was equally plausible. FBI agents began the painstaking process of tracking down every person who'd had contact with Ashford during the relevant time periods. They interviewed former students, colleagues, neighbors, and anyone who might have information about his activities. Several former students came forward with disturbing stories about Ashford's inappropriate interest in their personal lives and his tendency to offer special help to students who seemed troubled or isolated. One particularly chilling account came from Maria Santos, who'd been a 19-year-old student in Ashford's environmental science class in 2002. She remembered that Ashford had seemed unusually interested when she'd mentioned struggling with family problems and financial stress. He'd offered to let her stay at his cabin to focus on her studies without distractions. Something about his intensity had made her uncomfortable, and she'd declined. But she wondered now how many other students hadn't been as fortunate or as cautious. The investigation expanded to include missing persons cases from across the region, looking for patterns that might connect to Ashford's activities. They found troubling correlations. Several children had disappeared from areas where Ashford was known to have conducted research or camping trips. Some cases had been written off as accidental drownings or wild animal attacks, but investigators now wondered if they'd been looking at the crimes of a calculating predator who'd used his knowledge of wilderness areas to cover his tracks. Detective Hawthorne found herself working 18-hour days, driven by the possibility that Danny Reeves might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found. She studied every frame of the recovered video, looking for clues about the cabin's exact location within the building, trying to determine if there might be other hiding places that hadn't been discovered. The FBI's video analysis had identified several objects in the background that helped establish a timeline, but they also noticed something that gave Hawthorne chills. Danny appeared to be looking directly at someone off-camera for much of the recording, someone who was apparently encouraging him to speak. The realization that Ashford might not have been acting alone opened up terrifying new possibilities. If he'd had an accomplice, that person might still be active, might still pose a threat to other children. The investigation team began looking at Ashford's known associates, particularly anyone who'd helped him maintain the remote cabin or who'd had access to it during the relevant time periods. A breakthrough came when investigators discovered Ashford's detailed journals hidden in a safety deposit box at a whitefish bank. The journals, written in a code that FBI cryptographers worked around the clock to decipher, contained meticulous records of his activities dating back to 1985. As the coded entries were translated, a horrifying picture emerged of a man who'd viewed himself as a savior of children, believing he was protecting them from what he saw as a corrupt and dangerous world. The journals revealed that Ashford had developed an elaborate philosophy justifying his actions, believing that children were better off in his care than with families he deemed unfit or in a society he viewed as fundamentally toxic. He'd apparently studied his potential victims for months before acting, learning their routines, their family dynamics, and their vulnerabilities. The entries about Danny were particularly detailed, showing that Ashford had been watching the Reeves family for days before taking their son. Most significantly, the journals mentioned a partner in purpose who'd helped with the rescues and shared Ashford's vision of creating a pure community away from civilization's corrupting influences. This person was referred to only as G in the journals, but context clues suggested it was someone Ashford trusted implicitly and who had access to resources that helped facilitate the kidnappings and subsequent concealment of the children. The search for G became the investigation's top priority. FBI behavioral analysts theorized that this person might have been the one operating the camera during Danny's recorded message, and possibly the one who'd ultimately decided what happened to the children when they became too old or too aware of their situation to remain compliant. The thought that this individual might still be active, might have continued Ashford's work after the professor's death, drove the investigation team to work with renewed urgency. Meanwhile, Janet Reeves had traveled to Montana to be closer to the investigation. She checked into a small motel in Whitefish and spent her days walking the same trails her son might have walked, visiting the cabin where he'd been held, trying to feel some connection to the boy she'd lost so many years ago. Detective Hawthorne found her there one evening, sitting on the cabin's front porch in the fading light, clutching a photograph of 12-year-old Danny. "I keep thinking I should feel him here," Janet said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind in the pines. "People always talk about a mother's intuition, about knowing when your child is in danger or when they're safe. But I feel nothing. It's like he just vanished from the world completely, and I don't know if that means he's gone or if I just failed him so completely that I lost the connection." Detective Hawthorne sat beside her, struggling to find words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow or false. She'd seen too many families destroyed by cases like this, had watched hope turn to obsession and then to despair. But she'd also seen miracles, had worked cases where missing children were found alive years after everyone had given up hope. "The tape proves he survived," Hawthorne said finally. "He was smart enough to make that recording, brave enough to try to get a message out. That tells me he never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping he'd see you again." As they sat in the gathering darkness, neither woman could have known that less than 50 miles away, a man named Gerald Hutchins was watching news coverage of the investigation with growing alarm. Hutchins, who'd been Professor Ashford's teaching assistant and closest friend, had spent the past decade believing that his role in what Ashford called their rescue operations had ended with the professor's increasingly erratic behavior in the mid-2000s. Now, seeing investigators swarming over the cabin, knowing they'd found the tape, he realized his carefully constructed new life was about to crumble. Gerald had been G in Ashford's journals, the partner who'd helped plan and execute the kidnappings, who'd shared the professor's twisted belief that they were saving children from an unworthy world. But unlike Ashford, Gerald had never been driven by pure ideology. For him, the thrill had always been in the control, in the power to completely remake another person's reality, to become the center of a child's entire universe. When Ashford had died the previous winter, Gerald had assumed their secrets were safe. He'd been the one to clean out most of the professor's personal effects, had thought he'd destroyed all the evidence of their activities. The discovery that Ashford had hidden the tape and other materials without telling him was both infuriating and terrifying. Now Gerald faced an impossible choice: run and hope the authorities never connected him to the crimes, or stay and try to maintain his cover as a respectable member of the community who'd simply been friends with an apparently disturbed colleague. The decision was made for him when FBI agents appeared at his door 3 days later, armed with a search warrant and questions about his relationship with Professor Ashford. Gerald's carefully practiced story about being a casual friend who'd occasionally helped with yard work at the cabin began to fall apart under skilled interrogation. Faced with evidence from Ashford's journals that clearly implicated him as a co-conspirator, Gerald made a calculated decision that would finally bring closure to the Danny Reeves case. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Gerald agreed to cooperate fully with investigators and reveal everything he knew about their crimes. His confession painted a horrifying picture of systematic child abduction spanning nearly 2 decades. He revealed the locations where several victims were buried, led investigators to additional evidence caches, and most importantly, provided information about what had happened to Danny Reeves after the tape was recorded. According to Gerald's confession, Danny had indeed escaped from the cabin in late 2003, but not in the way anyone had imagined. The tape had been discovered by Ashford, who'd been furious about what he saw as a betrayal of the trust he'd tried to build with the boy. Gerald claimed that Ashford had planned to move Danny to a more secure location, but before that could happen, Danny had managed to seriously injure the professor during a struggle and had fled into the wilderness. What happened next became a source of both hope and heartbreak for everyone involved in the case. According to Gerald, Danny had survived in the wild for several days, using survival skills Ashford had ironically taught him during his captivity. He'd eventually made his way to a remote highway where he'd been picked up by a passing trucker. But instead of immediately contacting authorities, the traumatized 15-year-old had convinced the trucker that he was a runaway who just needed to get to a big city where he could start over. Gerald claimed he'd lost track of Danny after that, but FBI investigators weren't satisfied with that answer. Using the trucker's route information and timeline provided by Gerald, they began tracing Danny's possible path through the transportation network that moved goods and people across the American West. The search led them through truck stops and homeless shelters, through the underground communities where people go when they want to disappear from their old lives entirely. The breakthrough came when investigators showed Danny's age-progressed photograph at a homeless shelter in Seattle. A social worker recognized the face immediately, not as Danny Reeves, but as David Rivers, a quiet man in his early 20s who'd been living under that name for nearly a decade. He'd shown up at the shelter as a teenager, claiming to be an emancipated miner with no family, and had gradually built a new identity through the shelter system's network of support services. The man they found was barely recognizable as the 12-year-old boy who'd vanished from Bowman Lake. Years of trauma and life on the streets had aged him beyond his 24 years, but when Detective Hawthorne showed him the photograph of his parents, his carefully constructed emotional barriers crumbled. Through tears, he whispered, "I thought they were dead. He told me they were dead, and I believed him for so long that when I finally escaped, I didn't know how to come back." The reunion between Danny and his parents took place in a conference room at Seattle Police Headquarters, with counselors and investigators standing by to help navigate what everyone knew would be an emotionally overwhelming experience. Janet Reeves, now 53 years old, approached her son slowly, as if he might disappear again if she moved too quickly. Tom, who'd flown in from Denver where he'd been working, hung back, uncertain of his role in a relationship that had been frozen in time for 12 years. Danny, who'd lived as David Rivers for so long that he sometimes forgot his original name, struggled to reconcile his memories of his parents with the older, sadder people standing before him. The 12-year-old's image of his strong, confident father had been replaced by a man who looked broken by years of guilt and regret. His mother, once vibrant and always smiling, now seemed fragile, as if hope deferred had crystallized into something brittle that might shatter at any moment. The conversation was halting, awkward, filled with the weight of lost years and shared trauma. Danny learned that his parents had divorced, that his father had remarried and divorced again, that his mother had never given up searching for him. Janet and Tom learned that their son had survived horrors they could barely imagine, that he'd built a new life from nothing, that he'd become a man they'd never had the chance to know. But gradually, in the hours that followed, glimpses of the family they'd once been began to emerge. Danny smiled when his mother mentioned the fishing rod they'd found, abandoned by the lake. He remembered being excited about using it that morning, remembered thinking about the fish he'd catch and how proud his parents would be. Janet laughed through her tears when Danny asked if she still made her famous chocolate chip pancakes, the ones that had been his favorite breakfast on special occasions. The legal aftermath of the case was complex and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Gerald Hutchins pleaded guilty to multiple counts of kidnapping, child endangerment, and accessory to murder in connection with the deaths of other victims. His cooperation had been crucial to solving several cold cases, but it couldn't undo the damage done to the families whose children had never made it home. For the Reeves family, Gerald's trial became both a form of closure and a renewed source of trauma. Danny, testifying under his legal name with the support of trauma counselors, provided devastating testimony about his years in captivity and the psychological manipulation that had convinced him his parents were dead. His composure on the witness stand impressed everyone present, but those who knew him best could see the cost of revisiting those memories. The media attention surrounding the trial was intense, but carefully managed to protect Danny's privacy as he continued to rebuild his relationship with his parents and adjust to life as part of a family again. He'd chosen to keep using David Rivers as his professional name. He'd been working as a freelance writer and had built a reputation under that identity, but legally returned to Danny Reeves to honor the family connections he'd thought were lost forever. The process of healing was slow and sometimes frustrating for all three family members. Years of separation and trauma couldn't be erased by good intentions and family therapy sessions, though both helped enormously. Danny struggled with trust issues and a hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax, even in safe environments. Janet had to resist the urge to treat her adult son like the child she'd lost, while Tom worked to overcome the guilt that had driven him away from his family in the first place. But there were breakthrough moments that reminded them all why the effort was worthwhile. The first time Danny called Janet Mom again, 6 months after their reunion, she cried for an hour. When he asked Tom to teach him to change the oil in his car, something they'd planned to do together when Danny turned 13, both men found themselves grieving for the lost years while simultaneously celebrating the possibility of creating new memories. Detective Hawthorne followed the family's progress with the protective interest of someone who'd invested 12 years in bringing them back together. She attended Danny's 25th birthday party, a small gathering in Janet's Minneapolis apartment that marked not just another year of life, but another year of healing. Watching the three of them together, still tentative in some ways, still learning how to be a family again, but undeniably connected by bonds that had survived the worst trauma imaginable. She felt the particular satisfaction that came from seeing justice served and lives rebuilt. The case officially closed with Gerald Hutchins sentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Professor Ashford's crimes died with him, but his victims and their families finally had answers and, in some cases, the chance for healing. The investigation had led to the resolution of 6 other missing children cases, bringing closure to families who'd lived with uncertainty for decades. As Detective Hawthorne filed her final report on the Danny Reeves case, she reflected on the lessons it had taught her about the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of family bonds. Danny's survival had been remarkable, but perhaps even more remarkable was his family's ability to find their way back to each other after years of separation and grief. The VHS tape that had reopened the case was preserved as evidence, but its true value lay not in its role in securing convictions, but in its proof that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could survive. Danny's decision to record that message, knowing he might not live to see it discovered, had been an act of courage that ultimately saved not just his own life, but brought justice for other victims and peace to their families. Today, Danny works as a freelance journalist specializing in missing persons cases, using his unique perspective to bring attention to other families facing the nightmare his parents had lived through. Janet has returned to nursing and volunteers with organizations that support families of missing children. Tom, now retired, has moved back to Minneapolis to be closer to his son and ex-wife, and while he and Janet haven't remarried, they've found a new kind of partnership in supporting Danny's continued healing. The cabin in the Montana wilderness, where Danny spent 3 years of his childhood, has been demolished. The site returned to the forest that surrounds it. But the family that was torn apart beside Bowman Lake has been rebuilt, different than it was before, but stronger for having survived the unimaginable. Their story serves as a reminder that even when all hope seems lost, even when years pass without answers, the bonds that truly matter can endure anything.